Welcome back, everybody. It is Alex Wiseman here talking to you more about Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited. We're finally moving on to the chapter specifically about Japan. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about some of the information that was in the original Preschool in Three Cultures book that came out in 1989 that was authored by Tobin, Wu, and Davidson. In their original Preschool in Three Cultures book, they laid out some strategies that they saw that Japanese preschool teachers used for classroom management. And since managing the classroom and sort of dealing with the behavior of students is again one of the issues that they highlight in their chapter here, specifically with the girls and the one who cries in particular, I thought it would be helpful to look a little bit at what they said before. So in looking at the previous book, and let me just, I've got the book right here, let me just remind everyone, because they allude to it at the beginning of the chapter, that Hiroki was a boy that actually acted out quite a bit in the original book. And if you've read that book, you'll remember Hiroki. Hiroki was a rather rambunctious and, quite frankly, from an American perspective, a kind of a threatening kid to some of the other children in the preschool. And it became quite an issue, especially for American readers of this book, that there wasn't more intervention by the teachers to stop Hiroki from doing the things that he was doing or to more actively correct his behavior. And so the authors of the original book, Tobin and his pals, looked specifically at some of the ways that Japanese manage classrooms. And so they're listed here. One was that they tried to avoid confrontation with students. Right? And the reason for doing this was to encourage other children to take responsibility for correcting the behavior of the children that were acting out in whatever way or acting differently than the rest of the group. The idea was that if they did that, if they avoided direct confrontation with the students themselves as adults and teachers, that the rest of the children would have to step up. They'd have to learn how to interact with their colleagues, although it seems funny to say that about 4 and 5-year-olds. It also meant that they weren't excluding anyone from the group. So the argument originally made was that if the teachers had pulled Hiroki out and corrected him or admonished him for his behavior, that would have set him apart from the rest of the group. And that ultimately was not the goal. The goal was for Hiroki to become a part of the little society that was at the preschool. And so really the whole point of avoiding confrontation and allowing the other children to take responsibility for correcting or for guiding the behavior of themselves and others within their community was to create a more cohesive society that de-emphasized the individual rather than emphasized it. Now, that's interesting because that sort of ideological approach is, quite frankly, flipped from a more Western approach, and specifically a more American approach. A more American approach would say that individual was infringing upon the rights or the freedoms or the whatever of the other children, and so that individual was actually harming the group or the society because he or she, in Hiroki's case, he was getting more attention, was getting his way to dominate, etc., etc. So it's interesting that they have brought back another example of a child in the Japanese preschool that is again sort of having unusual behavior given what the other children are doing. The other thing that they brought up in the original Preschool in Three Cultures was that the principal, or male teachers in general, were allowed to play the heavy. And so if there ever was a time when there was more direct confrontation that was required, and at a preschool level it's not going to be that hardcore, but if there was, then it would be the principal or the male teacher who would do the reprimanding, and it would usually be quite severe. I can give you an example of this, actually. My career many years ago began as a English teacher and English teacher in Japan with the JET program, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. And I worked in several different middle schools or junior high schools in a community in Japan. And I have seen firsthand this male or principal playing the heavy actually happening. So much so that some of the boys in particular at this one middle school where I worked, who were constantly sort of acting out or trying to be different, would literally be taken into a back room where supplies were kept and would be hit by the male teachers. There'd be a lot of yelling, there'd be a lot of thrashing, there'd be a lot of hitting, and that was rare, but it did happen occasionally. So we've kind of got a contrast here in the original Preschool in Three Cultures, with the idea that we want to avoid confrontation between teacher and student versus that when confrontation is necessary, let's make sure that it is the male teacher or the principal playing the heavy. So let's take a look at, move that. Let's take a look at some of the text from our current version of Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited by Tobin, Hsee, and Kurosawa. And I've just made a scan of the page here, so you'll see that on a couple of these slides. This is what your book actually looks like, or at least it's what my book actually looks like. We're looking right now at page 108. So I have it in front of me here too. And I just wanted to point out this example. This is the example of Now. Now is sort of the 2002 version of Hiroki from 1984. And so what happened with Now is that sometimes let me make sure that I have my thing on. Starting right here. Well, first of all, actually, starting right here, Morita Sensei told us that the scenes we caught on video of the girls fighting over the bear, it's a teddy bear, go on intermittently every day. Sometimes the older girls provoke Nao by one of them beating her to the favorite bear at the beginning of a free play period, or snatching the bear the second she puts it down. More often, Nao is the initiator of the struggle. That's important. In either case, the staff at Kamatsudani conceptualizes the actions as the initiation of a game rather than as the first assault in a fight with a victim and an aggressor. That's important. Initiation of a game rather than the first assault in a fight. Thus, the question here is not who started the fight, but who initiated the social interaction. Whoever initiates once the game is on, the older girl's contribution is to block Nao's selfish desire to keep the bear to herself, to correct her behavior, and then to comfort her. So there's a whole cycle here. The older girl's contribution is to block Nao's selfish desire to keep the bear to herself, to correct her behavior, and then to comfort her. In other words, the interpretation that's been given here is that Nao is the one who's initiating this confrontation. There we go. I said it. And then the older girls who are involved in this aren't fighting with her. They're somehow correcting her behavior and then comforting her at the end. It goes on to say, the older girls sometimes provoke Nao, but they rarely leave her frustrated, as would be the situation if this were a case of bullying. Okay, we can talk about whether or not that's the case or not in a second. Nao is repeatedly scolded by the girls, but also frequently consoled. Indeed, it could be argued that the purpose of the scolding is to provide an opportunity for the consoling, and the purpose of Nao's misbehavior is to provide an opportunity to be scolded, and thereby eventually consoled. So, the interpretation is that this is not a confrontation, but is a social interaction, and that the initiation is on the part of the girl who might be perceived as the victim from an outsider's perspective, which I definitely would have, right? But instead, they're saying that this is not a victim and perpetrator type of behavior. This is instead a planned social interaction, and that the girls who are older than Nao are actually participating in this activity in order to help Nao understand how to interact with them and how to sort of be a less selfish person. So one of the things that is pointed out right at the end of this page, and you can see I have it already highlighted in my pencil here, is that well, let me start up here. Many of the Japanese teachers and directors who approved of Morita Sensei's non-intervention approach expressed appreciation for the value of young children being given the opportunity to be kodomo rashi, which is childlike. And then they go on to say that compared to their Chinese and American counterparts, Japanese early childhood educators tend to give a higher value to and to have a higher tolerance for the childlike, physically expressed behaviors of children. In other words, they're making the argument that Chinese and American educators would not be as hands-off, would not go the non-interference route in the situation that is just played out up here, right? Instead, they would be more interventionist. But it's because, Tobin and his colleagues are arguing, that the Japanese have more tolerance and place higher value on childlike, physically expressed behaviors of children. So when children act like children, they're saying, the Japanese preschool teacher's response is to let them act that out and understand that this is actually an educable moment. It's just that the teacher isn't directing the education. Now that is an interesting approach, and I think it's a slightly controversial one. Some of you have posted some comments already on our discussion board about this particular situation. And you'll see that on pages 109 through 110, they actually go through some of the criticisms that other people have given to this non-interventionist approach. They say that first, some saw value in the practice of teachers giving children opportunities to work out their disputes, but say that in this situation they would have intervened more quickly and more aggressively than Morita Sensei did. So maybe they would have let it play out a little bit, but the criticism is that it shouldn't have been allowed to go on so long. A second category of criticism, I'm on 109, right, is a Japanese version of Neo-Vygotskian constructivism. All right, I don't know if you're familiar with Neo-Vygotskian constructivism. Vygotsky was a very famous in child psychology and child development, and had a particular way of thinking about constructivism, the way that we construct meaning, that we often study in child development courses in a more traditional sort of education program. Anyway, second category is that a Japanese version of this Neo-Vygotskian constructivism is a viewpoint that emphasizes the teacher's role in scaffolding children's cognitive and social development in situations including their fighting, meaning that the teacher should have intervened not just more quickly, but also because the teacher can actually make this a scaffolded learning experience. And that would help the children's cognitive and social development rather than letting it play out without any apparent result or outcome or positive result. Okay. A third criticism are that, in particular, are criticisms from teachers and directors at Christian preschools who see non-intervention in children's fights as a traditional Japanese practice that they see as a flaw of Japanese society. In which, by the way, I want to go on to say that there's a connection between 3 and 4. Because the argument here is that it's cruel to let children taunt or tease or bully other children without intervening. The flipped approach, the approach that Morita Sensei was taking, was that this was the best way, actually, to address these issues because it helps the children learn how to work out their issues themselves. And then finally on page 110, there's a very direct statement about this approach promoting bullying because it is something that has happened quite frequently in Japan and will continue to be a problem there. I just looked at the clock. We're going to pause here and come back in the next screencast.